Okay, so what I'm going to do this morning, I'm going to explain some of the basics of the class system, going right back into sort of medieval roots, bringing it up to the 19th century and Dickens's day. Hello? Yeah. We tend to think of the class system in terms of three social classes, and those would be, of course, upper class, middle class, lower class. It's always been a lot more complicated than that. It's never been just as straightforward as three social classes. Even if we go back to the feudal system of the Middle Ages, we can see that there's quite a lot more going on than just three social classes. They're quite complicated relationships of status, power going on at that time. Usually, if you kind of Google for the feudal system, you'll see a kind of pyramid coming up, something like this. And of course, social class structures are usually pyramid structures, hierarchies of power. And at the top, you've got the king. And under the king, you've got the nobles. And then kind of protecting the nobles and fighting for the king, you've got the knights, the kind of warrior class. And then you've got the ordinary people, peasants or serfs. So that's what we usually think of. But as I say, it's not really as simple as that. And if you look at it in detail, you find that there's a lot more going on. So let's just take a little look. For example, the king. Okay, but there were weak kings. The king wasn't always the strongest person at the top there. There were weak kings as well as strong ones. And of course, there wasn't just a king. There would be a whole royal family. There'd be a queen, princes, princesses, the whole show. Usually, I mean, not always, but usually there'd be a royal family. So it wouldn't just be one person. And then you'd have people who were in a kind of position very close to the king. They would be called regents. They would stand in for the king when he was ill or when he was traveling. They would have to go, for political reasons or to fight a war somewhere in some distant country or whatever the heck it was. And there'd be regents who would stand in for them. There were local leaders, viceroys who would rule a province. And again, they would have almost the same powers as a king. So just saying the king was at the top, well, yeah, but even that's not as simple as that. And we'll see that there's another complication in another minute or two. So moving on to the first of the three social classes, the nobility, of which the king would be the top. Okay, he's not really a social class in himself. Even his family doesn't constitute a social class. So the nobles and the king would be the top rank of social class. And the nobility was divided into various ranks. So inside itself it had a hierarchy. You've got dukes and their wives are duchesses. You've got marquesses and marchionesses and earls and countesses and viscounts and a whole range of titles that some of them would be hereditary, so that they would pass on to the children of that family and to the next generation and carry on through the generations. Some of them would end when the person himself died, or herself, in the case of a woman. So the social class of the nobles was not just a single social class, it had its own hierarchy within itself. Saying that knights were, the next class, well, again, there were various orders of knights, various classes of knights. Some of them would have more status or less status, a better horse or a nicer suit of armour or whatever. In other cases, it was a sort of lateral thing that they weren't of any particular difference in rank. They just were divided into different orders for the purpose of organisation. And the peasantry too. You'd be able to pick out at least 3 classes of peasantry. There would be serfs, who were little better than slaves. You'd have yeomen, who were still subject to a lord or master, but they had a degree more freedom. And freemen, who would be lower class, but they were not bound to a lord, as most probably, especially in the 11th century and 12th centuries after the Norman conquest, most of the Anglo-Saxon people were put in that position of being serfs, but slowly they would get their freedom over a period of generations. So even the peasant class was not a single mass of people. There were gradations inside them. And then, of course, in the middle, along with the knights, or at a fairly similar sort of level of social standing, although different in terms of power, you've got the merchants, okay, some of whom might be very rich. You've got the scribes. Remember, most people couldn't read or write, so if a document was needed, a scribe would have to be employed. You've got the craftsmen, the people who would, well, for example, build those extraordinary churches during the medieval period, and the people who would decorate them. You've got people who are not, they're not at that bottom level of the serfs or the peasants. They're not knights, they're not nobles. Okay, they're a fairly small but nevertheless important, I suppose what we call today they would correspond to a middle class. Okay? And then you've got the church, which had its own hierarchy, completely separate from the hierarchy, or to a fair extent separate from the hierarchy of the king and the nobles and that set of social structures. So alongside the king, you theoretically had the Pope as being even more important, although he was a long way away. He would be in Italy, but the church had tremendous power. So if the Pope said something, even the king would have to listen. So the social structure is complicated by the fact that you've got a parallel hierarchy going on inside the church. And that's divided into 2 branches. The secular clergy who mix with the ordinary people, and when you go to church, that's the Shimpusama, that's the priest who will conduct the mass, the service. And you've got the regular clergy who lived in monasteries or convents, locked away, separate from the everyday life of most people. They would do work with the poor very often. They would do charitable work for the poor. And in that way, the social structure of the Middle Ages had its kind of safety net to a certain extent for poor people through the church. And so you've got a church hierarchy which has actually 2 branches. So it's not just a single structure in itself. It's got 2 sides to it. And that's obviously, very significant. People in those days, they lived their lives believing that their life was only a passing through stage. The real purpose was to die in such a way that one would go to heaven. So, for a lot of people, I'm not saying that they didn't think that this life was important. It would depend on the individual. But the culture of the society was, look, you're not here to have fun. You're not here to enjoy yourself. You're here to serve and to serve God. And you serve God by serving your earthly masters, by serving your king, by serving your Lord, by fitting into society in the right way. And earning your place in heaven. So the church would have considerable influence over people's lives. And the higher levels of the clergy, the church men, had a big influence and enjoyed more or less the same sort of status as the nobility. They would be kind of influencing the country at that level. So I'm going to make a big jump, okay? I'm going to skip the early modern period, the 16th century, the 17th century, more or less. I'm just going to jump into the century before Dickens's time, the 18th century, and just show what was left, or how that medieval system had changed, and what we had by the time the 18th century came along, the century before Dickens. So, well, this feudal system, in its pure form, it lasted up until about the middle of the 14th century. And one of the big things that knocked a hole in it and destabilized it was the Black Death, the plague, pesito. Okay, you use the French gaigo, or maybe from Portuguese, pesito. It's plague in English, and the Black Death wiped out about half the population of Europe. And just normal hierarchies were disrupted for a period of time. For example, skilled workers were very much in demand and could get big increases in pay if they survived, because so many others would be dead, and they still needed people to do that work. So the feudal system actually started to change around about the middle of the 14th century, but it carried on in some form or another until the middle of the 17th century, when it was finally, what was left of it was finally abolished. And the idea of somebody being a serf or being bound to serve another person for life completely vanished. And then by the time you get to the beginning of the 18th century, you've still got, in those general terms, three social classes that would be known as the gentry, the top of the hierarchy, the merchant classes, or middle classes, and labourers, people who worked with their hands. But again, it was more complicated than that. So again, let's take a little look in a little bit more detail and see what it was looking like in the century before Dickens came along. This would be the typical image of the gentry. They didn't work for a living. That would be particularly in the 18th century and also to a certain extent into the 19th century. That would be the central characteristic of the gentry. They didn't work. They didn't need to. They were rich enough not to have to work. Also, the economics of the 18th century was such that people with a large amount of money could invest that money and get a guaranteed 10% return on their money. So by investing at that kind of stable and fairly guaranteed level, as the economy was expanding through the British Empire, they would get a guaranteed 10% every year, which would be quite enough for them to live comfortably. And the capital, the bulk of the money, would just be sitting there growing every year. And they would also have inherited land very often. And in fact, yes, that would normally be a part of their inheritance. And hence they were usually referred to as the landed gentry. The gentry who owned land. And when I say they owned land, as we shall see in a minute, it was a large, it wasn't just like having a garden or something, or it was like having a whole huge park or area of countryside that belonged to you. And all they did really was manage their wealth and govern the country when they weren't busy hunting or pursuing their hobbies. They would have to look after their economic wealth to some extent, okay? They would have to manage the investments, that sort of activity, although they would employ people to do as much of that as possible, and they would be responsible for forming the government and running the country. By the 18th century, the king was no longer of such importance, so government was of huge importance. And pretty much all the members of parliament came from this gentry class at that stage. And there might be members of the middle classes, the merchant classes, who were quite considerably richer than some of the gentry. But they would not be respected in the same way because they actually worked. They actually got their hands dirty. So, might be a little bit difficult for us to understand now, but that was the way they thought about it, that if you were actually having to earn your money, you were in a lower, inferior position. You can see that sort of thing in Thackeray, for example. One of the characters in his school days is bullied and teased because his father was a vegetable merchant selling fruit and vegetables. So, yes, when I say they owned land, people like Mr. and Mrs. Andrews here, painted by Gainsborough in around the middle of the 18th century, all of this land would belong to them. Okay, you can see the cornfield here, that would be bringing in money. There would be people who would work on that field and bring in money, farming the land. You can see the sheep over here again, that there would be a shepherd who would be responsible for those. He's got his gun, there would be rabbits, pheasants, and those sorts of things on the estate, and it would be his hobby to shoot them, and servants would cook them up for big feasts with his sort of social group. They would spend their lives going from one party to another, a bit like Mr. Rochester in Jane Eyre. At a certain point during the story, he seems to be just going from one big party to the other. And you can see that in a number of 18th and 19th century novels where the upper class just live a life of absolute total luxury. There would also often be a whole village on the estate. And in such cases, the villagers would be paying rent to the lord of the manor. They would be working for the lord of the manor, so they get their pay from him, and then they'd have to pay back their rent to him, or else the rent would be taken off before it was paid. So their whole, although the system of serfs no longer existed, they were in a very similar relationship, and from birth till death they would sort of bow and doff their hats whenever he and his lady wife went riding by. And so it was a very, very socially divided society in terms of the higher class and the lower class. And they would live on the profit that came from the land, and they would live on the profit from their investments. And this would be the upper class in the 18th century. But then not everybody would fit that stereotype. Okay? There were going to be people from high-class families who would have respect because they were high class. They were born into high-class families, but they wouldn't have all that money. Basically, the system of inheritance was such that the eldest son would get everything. This was so that properties didn't end up getting divided into smaller and smaller and smaller plots. as happened in, for example, in Spain or certain other countries where the inheritance system was to give all the children, some of the land, and that would end up with people owning little bits of land spread out over very inconveniently, and so you can see those results in the countryside, the shape of the countryside, and in the society even today. What happened then to other children? The second son typically would join the army, not as a regular soldier, but as a commissioned officer. A commission would be a post that would be bought. A lot of jobs in these days, you had to buy the job. You bought the position. And they would buy their position, well, their family would buy the position as a commissioned officer, and having bought the position, they would then forget, well, at least in terms of economics, they would forget about that son. He's in the army, he gets paid by the army, he's sorted. That's his life. He's a commissioned officer. And if there were more sons, then the third son would typically enter the church. And again, this was a bought position. It would be called a living. And the family, the father of the family would talk around and find out where there was a living going. A living would be a parish, it would be a church, and it would be the job of the third son to stand up and be the kind of reverend vicar for that area. And the villagers would come to that church and they would pray there, and he would give sermons there. And you can see from the structure here, if you were a second son, but you weren't especially somebody who was, wanted to go off and kill people, fight. They really, that's the custom. That's what you're expected to do. And if you're not somebody who's sort of all the time thinking about praying to God, well, I'm sorry, but in this society, that's what you're expected to do. Would you just do it, please? Okay, so of course, a lot of these people would not necessarily be particularly suitable. All right, and again, you'll get something like, Jane Austen satirizing the people in those kinds of positions as being totally unsuitable, especially the church. Okay, some of them are hypocrites and foolish people who have got themselves into that position through family connection, but really were not men of God or anything like it. So tradition was influencing the society in all sorts of ways. And those people, they wouldn't be kind of very, very rich like their big brother, who would have inherited the whole property, but they'd be comfortable and they'd be respected. They'd be, very respected members of society because of their family connections, because of their blood. And what about the daughters? Well, basically the assumption was that they would marry someone rich. And again, the marriage would be, to a certain extent, bought. The dowry system is where money is given to the husband when the woman marries. So people would sort of buy their way into the best marriage for their daughter that they could get, and then again they would just leave that. The daughter would not be their responsibility anymore. The daughter would be the responsibility of that husband. It would be a combination of physical attractiveness, money, and affection, I suppose, although affection was usually considered to play only a very small part. Children were expected to do what their parents told them. They were expected to marry who their parents felt they should marry. They were expected to join the church or the army according to their parents' wishes. Although you do get quite a lot of novels about children who do not want to obey. All right, Fielding's Tom Jones would be a good example. He runs all around the country avoiding those kinds of responsibilities and marrying a woman whose father does not want her to marry him, and that sort of thing. So, although, again, that's the typical pattern, not everybody would conform. Some people would say, no, I'm not doing that. So, also, there would be some of the highborn people who would just sort of fall through the cracks, as it were. They just wouldn't be a soldier, they wouldn't be a churchman, they would end up poor, okay? Family fortunes could be lost. Well, in the army, for example, and in certain circles of society, gambling was a huge thing. And people could be ruined overnight, even, by gambling. All right, so that could happen. Daughters, of course, typically, the danger was that they'd end up as old maids. And again, Jane Austen writes about characters like Miss Bates in Emma. Jane Austen writes about these old maids who are of good family, but they've grown old without ever marrying. So they are sort of left on the shelf. And they would be pitied by their social equals, those who were sort of on the same social level as them, and they would kind of try and help them along and be charitable towards them. But basically, they would be respectable, okay? They wouldn't be like working class people in terms of their position in society, but they would be poor. They would go to the picnics and parties along with the rich people, but they would always be, somebody would say, could anybody arrange for a carriage to take Miss Bates home, or something like this? The poor old lady, she hasn't got anybody to look after her, she hasn't got enough money, can we make sure that she gets home safely, this sort of thing. So they would kind of gather around and help those kinds of people. There was a sense of community about it, but she would not economically be able to hold her position in the society, although she would be respected because of her family connections. And in the same way as people could drop down in various ways from the upper class, so people from the middle classes, or even on occasion from the lower classes, could work their way up. Now that was something that could also happen. Take this for now. Okay. So although the aristocrats might say, okay, blue blood, aristocratic family, I want my daughter to marry somebody who's part of that old tradition of rich people. Along comes a merchant, a very rich merchant, who's got a very nice house and a very handsome son. And of course the family's going to say, well, maybe that's not such a bad idea after all. Okay? And for that family, of course, it would pull that family up socially. They would now be socializing with the old aristocratic traditional elite. And this was, during the 18th and going on into the 19th century, this was a big part of the elite's problem. You've got a growing middle class, you've got the newly rich people through the expansion of empire, through the Industrial Revolution. People have made themselves fabulously rich, and what are we going to do? They've bought or built a beautiful house just a mile or two away from us. Should we invite them to our party? Should we invite them for coffee? What should we do? And basically, if they had good manners, if they had good taste, they could be accepted into high society. There was even a form of English that was developed for candidates for admission to higher levels of society called received pronunciation, or RP. And even today, you can still hear the effects of that. And all over the world, even, not just inside Britain, but educated forms of English are close to this idea of received pronunciation. Received because they would be received into the society, into the high society, if they spoke properly. I'll try and show you what I mean. Bear with me if my accent isn't quite perfect, but you've got social class and education on the vertical of the pyramid and language variation on the horizontal. Okay? So if you look at people at the top here, if you went to Oxford or Cambridge University today, you might hear quite a lot of people who are speaking an English which is not so different from the English that I'm speaking now. And if you went to a university in America, you might hear somebody who's talking a little bit more like this, but you wouldn't have any difficulty understanding that person because that person was speaking in an educated form of the language. And if you went to the University of Jamaica and you heard a black man who was a professor who was talking to you, you would know that he was black. All right? But you would clearly understand what he was saying because you're learning, and all over the world people are learning this received form of English, sometimes called the Queen's English, sometimes called BBC English. It's basically the same thing. And there's very little language variation up there at the top of the pyramid in terms of higher social class or more educated strata of society. But if you were to go down onto the streets, and let's say you were in Jamaica and you went out onto the streets, people, instead of saying, I want to, you hear people say, me want fe. Me want fe. Okay? Or if you were in London, for example, people might say, instead of I'm going home, they might say, I'm going home. I'm going home. Instead of I'm going home. I'm going home. Right? So it's rather different, okay? If you went onto the streets of Cambridge, they might be saying, well, actually not in Cambridge, but in the villages around Cambridge, they say, I'm going home. I'm going home. That's I'm going home. I'm going home. All right? Okay. It's pretty different, right? Somehow got a bit out of kilter here, but if we went up to the city that I was born in, Newcastle, in the north of England, which has a very strong local dialect, they say, I'm ganning yen. Going is ganning. I'm ganning yen. Going home, ganning yen. Okay? Okay? So you can see that language variation is much greater if you walk out onto the street. Okay? Than if you're inside the university or in a kind of higher social level, the language variation tends to be very much narrower, even today. Now there is still quite a lot of, it has changed to a certain extent because there is much more pride in local accents than there used to be. People used to lose their accent, the way Japanese people from Aomori lose their accent when they come to Tokyo. Okay, people used to lose their low-class, low-prestige accent. These days it's become quite trendy on the television. Okay, when I was a boy, you never heard those accents on the television, not on the news programs or anything like that. Maybe in a drama, but not in kind of formal television programs. Now it's very common, and you'll have university lecturers who teach their lesson in some of them in quite strong dialect forms of the language. So that it's changing to a certain extent now, but that's a basic kind of pattern that you'll still find. Okay, so the higher social class, the lower the language variation, and the lower the social class or the lower the level of education, the higher the variation in language. That's the tendency. And again, the middle classes in this period, well, they would also be pretty, there'd be a lot of variation among the middle classes. Like I said, merchants, the first thing we think of is merchants because it was a time when people were buying and selling all over the world, developing the empire, the Industrial Revolution. It was all about producing goods, selling stuff, and some people would be selling goods, other people would be selling services, and still others, as we said in an earlier class, would be selling slaves. And also you've got the professions. As society becomes more specialized, you start to get doctors, lawyers, you get architects, engineers, you get people with specialized skills who, they're working in an important way for society. So they would be adding their numbers to the middle classes. And incidentally, their numbers would be increasing so much that their wives in particular would very often not have anything to do during the daytime, and that's why they started to read novels. And the novel itself became popular during that period. And those professional middle-class people would need to have the support of secretaries or clerks, scribes, notaries, all kinds of literate people, people who had a good command of the language, who could write it neatly and clearly, to work under them. All right, so there's a general sort of expansion of the middle classes going on at this time. And those people, scribes and so on, so very often they would be considered middle class rather than working class because they were working with a pen and paper rather than working with their hands in a labouring sense. They weren't labouring. The working class was very much the labouring class, but depending on the degree of training and responsibility, those clerks might be regarded as more working class or lower middle class. And, okay, finally the lower classes, the labouring classes, well, there would be skilled craftsmen. It didn't matter how skilled they were, they would still be considered working class. There'd be a big difference. Even if they were earning more money than a clerk or a scribe, they would very often be considered working class, or they would inevitably be considered working class, whereas the scribe would very often be considered middle class because of the kind of work they did. You'd get smallholders who were farming their own land. You'd get subsistence farmers who had no rights to the land and were living a sort of day-to-day existence, lucky if they could feed their family tomorrow and hope that next week it would be a little bit better kind of style of life. And they would all be seen as working class. And one of the things that, made it difficult to get a higher class status in the 18th century was the fact that there were very few schools. There was very little education available for people at that social level. And the Industrial Revolution really started to change that. And you get, on the one hand, you are getting more schools and more chances for education, slowly growing up. But the negative side was that people were forced off the land and forced into factories. They really didn't have any choice about this. It's not like, oh, let's go and work in the factory. No, there's a new law come in, especially these farmers who do not have rights of ownership, these subsistence farmers. They're being told, you can't stay here any longer. Even though their family may have been farming that land or using that land for hundreds of years, no, it's finished. That land is now private. It's been given to rich people. Rich people have taken it, and it's no longer yours to use. So they would be forced into the cities, and they would be forced into working in factories or coal mines and that sort of thing. So England, because of the Industrial Revolution, became the first country in which you had more people living in the towns and cities than actually lived in the countryside. And also, a lot of those old skills, like weaving and hand making of clothes and that kind of artisan work became redundant. Machines were taking over the production of these things. So society was changing in that way as well. Skilled workers of that kind were not needed anymore. So you've got huge social changes taking place towards the end of the 18th century as a result of the Industrial Revolution. So let's move on now to Dickens's era. A lot of the class system of this period that we had in the 18th century, it carried on like that. So quite a lot of the things that I've said about the 18th century would also be true in the 19th century. You got more specialized skills, and you've got more marketing and producing of goods, and the middle classes are continuing to grow. And in the 1830s, many of them get the right to vote, which kind of puts them on a different social level. They have some influence on the government. And as the 19th century progressed, more and more middle-class people, and in fact that really extended down into the working classes by the end of the century. It wasn't a class thing anymore, it was just a right. The voting was something that people had a right. Are there any more prints for the... Oh, you've got a print there. Okay, so voting was a right for people. The only very big but there would be that women didn't have that right. But it was no longer a class thing where only the upper classes could vote or had any say in the government. The right to vote spread through all the classes of society during the 19th century. And again, still perhaps a little bit surprisingly for people today, and especially in Japan, where social class would all be about money, and as it is in America, even today in Britain, social class is not entirely about money. Okay, and in the 19th century, it would be mostly your profession, not how much money you were getting, that would determine your social class. So if you're working with your hands, as I said before, however skilled you were, you'd still be considered working class. And if you're working in an office, you'd be considered middle class, even if you were getting a lower salary than a skilled manual worker. There were still differences between the landed gentry and the high-level professionals or the heads of business, but those differences are beginning to blur. They're beginning to kind of fuzz over, because really the gentry, if they're going to keep that level of wealth, they need to get involved in business themselves. They need to get involved in banking, involved in the banking process. It's getting more and more a case where everybody needs to do a certain amount of work in order to maintain their position in society. So by the end of the 19th century, you don't really have an upper class that just doesn't work anymore. They've become the sort of high-level banking class, or the people at the heads of industry, the way we have it today, where the heads of industry or the top bankers or these people are at the elite of society, and that was kind of a process that was getting underway even in Victorian times. And also the cultural superiority. I mean, they could feel superior to people who couldn't read and write during the 18th century, but during the 19th century, education spread, and it was no longer unusual for people to be able to read and write. You had to be able to show a little bit more than that in order to demonstrate that you were culturally superior to others. So, your university degree would begin to matter. Your ability to write papers connected with important scientific developments or that kind of thing, it was starting to matter. So the upper classes were becoming more concerned about protecting the status of universities like Oxford and Cambridge, which is, they were, during Victorian times, they were more or less uniquely for the upper, well, they were uniquely for the upper classes. Thomas Hardy, writing, late 19th and early 20th century, his novel Jude the Obscure tells the most terrible story of a very gifted, academically minded, working class person. And the terrible tragedy that happens to him and his family, because that's all he wants to do. He just wants to go to university, which, you all can do. And he ends up with his family his children kill themselves because they think that's the best thing for them. It's a desperately unhappy novel. I mean, Hardy is not a cheerful writer, but this is a desperately miserable situation. It's a heartbreaking story of a man who should have been an academic, but because of his social status, sorry, it's not appropriate for you to enter these sacrosanct premises. You can't come to Oxford, you can't come to Cambridge, you can't be a member of the academic elite because of your social class. So that became protected areas of the upper classes. Okay, let's move on now to Dickens himself. The novel is a genre that really lends itself to satire. Satire is what the novel is all about, really. Not all novels are satires, but satire comes into almost every novel you can think of at some point. Dickens certainly is no exception to that, and he is particularly interested in social class. I should explain, satire is really social irony. Irony on society is satire, basically, if you want a simple definition of satire. It's a kind of irony, all right? It's kind of looking at the gizeng, the hypocrisy of society, and saying, look at this, look at what they do, look at the things they do, look at the things they say, look at how they waste their lives with those things that are not really important. And so in Dickens's case, he pokes fun at the pretensions of the socially ambitious, people who want to better themselves, people who want to raise their social class. He's very often deeply ironic and satirical towards those people. You can see it in Great Expectations. Pip has become snobbish because he's going to be a gentleman. And his brother-in-law, Joe, is a fine human being, a really good man. And Joe, as I'll show you later on after this presentation in a video clip, Joe is treated so badly by Pip when he goes to visit Pip in London. And then, of course, Pip is faced with the truth of his aspirations, that all his money that he's been given, that he thinks has come from a high-class lady, has actually come from a criminal, from Magwitch. And so he then has to suffer this shock. We saw that last week, if you remember. So the point that Dickens makes very clearly here is, look, there's nobody in this world who could be a better person than Joe. There's nobody in this world who could be better than, well, I wouldn't say nobody who could be better than Magwitch, but Magwitch, although he's a rough diamond, he does have a heart, a very good, strong heart, that Pip finally comes to understand what Magwitch has sacrificed, what Magwitch has done for him. And he feels ashamed that he behaved like that towards Joe. He feels ashamed of his initial reaction to Magwitch. He realizes that true nobility is not about money or status or being high class or anything like that. Dickens's particular dislike was people like Mr. Bumble the Beadle in Oliver Twist. People who see their own social advancement purely and simply as a way to mistreat people below them, to get one step up and then kick the person who's just underneath them. And he gets paid back in Oliver Twist. He has to die in the same workhouse where he has mistreated others. So he suffers exactly the same mistreatment as he himself inflicted when he was a beadle. What Dickens didn't usually do was attack the established elite. All right? Some writers did. Some writers would lampoon the higher classes. Dickens generally, or at least pretty frequently, shows high-class people as gentle, well-meaning people like Mr. Brownlow in Oliver Twist. The gentleman who trusts Oliver and does everything he can to help him. All right? Mr. Brownlow. So if you're still copying. So you've got lots of characters like that. You've got Herbert Pocket, for example, a very decent person from a good family in Great Expectations, Pip's friend. You've got characters like that, people from good families, and they're good people. And Dickens quite often is sort of flattering the reader by saying, I know that most of you are like that. Most of you are like Herbert Pocket or Mr. Brownlow. I know you're not bad people. And so, although he does attack class pretensions, he doesn't often attack the higher social classes, not in the way that some other novelists from the period sometimes do. And then the novel in which he most explores various types of criticism of society would be his last complete novel, a very complex novel with a huge cast of characters, but the central plot revolves around a dustman who inherits a fortune. And we're around about the middle of the novel, we're getting worried. Will Mr. Boffin, will he become corrupted by that wealth? And Bella Wilfer, who starts off completely corrupt and said, money, money, all I want to do is marry a rich man. I know what you're going to say, but that's all I want to do, I just want money. Right? She's got a very clear sense of what money can do for her. In the end, Mr. Boffin teaches her that money isn't everything. And that would be like, I suppose, the central plot, although it's a very complicated plot with a huge range of characters. And most of them are involved in some way with Boffin's fortune, and some of them coming out well, and some of them coming out badly, but mostly based on this question of, do they aspire? Dickens hates these people who want to be something better in society, this snobbish ambition. What's it all for? He tells us time and time again. Okay? Now, this presentation is slightly unfinished. I was a bit rushed this week, but that's where I'm leaving it, because that's as much as I could get done. All right?